We are back, and we are joined now by Margaret Power, Professor Emerita of History at Illinois Institute of Technology, author of Solidarity Across the Americas, the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, and Anti-Imperialism. Margaret, thanks so much for coming on the program today.
My pleasure.
So, Puerto Rico is considered a United States territory. Okay,
Mm.
so territory, that's key because isn't that just a fancy way of saying colony?
It certainly is, both legally and in terms of reality, in terms of what it means to be living in Puerto Rico, in terms of what it has meant to be living in Puerto Rico since 1898, when the U.S. invaded under the pretext that it was there to give freedom and independence from Puerto Rico, which was then a Spanish colony.
And can you talk a bit about that history then? A quick rundown for our audience, how it started as a Spanish colony and then the Spanish-American War and how the United States took control of Puerto Rico.
Yes, as part of Spanish colonialism, Puerto Rico was taken as a colony along with Cuba, Hispaniola, and then from there onto the mainland Mexico, and then further south into Peru. And then both Mexico and Peru were the key centers, but the Caribbean was also crucial both for Spanish and U.S. colonialism because it was the gateway into Latin America. And then Puerto Rico gained a special military and geopolitical importance for the United States because of the seaways into the Caribbean passed right through on the coast of Puerto Rico. And once the Panama Canal was built, that which was so essential for U.S. geopolitical military control, not only of Latin America, but also of Asia, Puerto Rico was also central to that.
And can you talk about the legal distinction between colony and territory? I mean, people in Puerto Rico can't vote for president, but they can come to the United States and move here to the mainland, and then they can participate in U.S. elections. But if you're on on the territory slash colony of Puerto Rico, your rights are very different.
Well, exactly. Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens. They were given citizenship, or some would say citizenship was imposed upon them in 1917 during World War I, and it was viewed as a way to tie Puerto Ricans into the United States and to prevent what both then and in during World War II, which was a German incursion into the area and from there into the United States. So if you're Puerto Rican, born in Puerto Rico, you are a U.S. citizen, regardless of if you're there or in the United States, but you can't vote. Not only can you not vote for president, you can't vote for senator, you cannot vote for a congressperson, you vote in no federal election whatsoever. If you come to the United States, then you can vote. So I'd always ask my students, for example, do Puerto Ricans need a visa to come to the United States? And my non-Puerto Rican students would always say, either be puzzled or say, well, yes, of course they are, because the vision was if you're outside the United States and you're Latino, then you need a visa. So I think it's very contradictory. And what it means is that basically Puerto Ricans don't have the same kind of rights. So I'll give one example of what that means is after Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico, it meant that Puerto Ricans did not get the same kind of assistance that people in the United States got. And we know that people in the United States didn't always get the greatest assistance, so we can imagine that it was even worse. People could not declare bankruptcy in Puerto Rico. That's just sort of like, why? They're just not, they can't.
Which is amazing too, because those are kind of the austerity politics that the United States has imposed on their government. So it's both austerity for the citizenry and for the government. That's more modern. I want to get there in a little bit, or more, I guess relevant to our current moment. But what was it about the politics of the United States that, after colonizing Puerto Rico, taking it in the Spanish-American War, that made them want to downplay that it was colonialism as opposed to, it's just a territory?
Initially, it wasn't such an issue because the United States propaganda or discourse was that, of course, Puerto Ricans should become citizens, but at this point, Puerto Ricans are basically children. There was this whole sense of infantilizing the Puerto Ricans, and they're not really ready to vote. They're not really ready to be citizens, but we're here with the whole educating and civilizing mission. So in time, some point in time, that will happen. Then when it really hit this, changed the idea that, oh, we cannot actually possibly let people know that Puerto Rico is a colony, happened during the Cold War, when there's basically the United States versus the Soviet Union saying, no, we're the most democratic, we support liberation, we support independence. And here all these nations were having struggles for national liberation, for national independence. And I just want to put in a little commentary on the Nationalist Party, which was the party that led the struggle for independence from the 1920s through the 1950s. They had built relationships with different organizations, individuals, governments throughout, especially throughout Latin America. And all these people were key and were instrumental, and they were totally aware that Puerto Rico was a colony of the United States. So in order to disguise the fact that the United States had a colony, i.e. Puerto Rico, the United States worked with Puerto Ricans who were willing to work with the United States to engineer this whole really basically an illusionary idea that Puerto Rico was independent, and it's called a free associated state, which means what? It means nothing, really, because they're not free, they're not associated. They are associated, I suppose. They're not a state, and that's what Puerto Rico's status is to this day, which is why you can be a citizen in Puerto Rico but not be able to vote for the president or any federal office.
Okay, so you mentioned the nationalist parties, which is central to what your book explores, nationalism, and writing about it in a different way than I think a lot of us on the left in the United States or broadly think about the term nationalism. Often it's a method to subjugate, like Christian nationalism, white nationalism, Zionism, right?
Fascism.
Fascism, exactly,
Right.
right? Like this, in the context of Puerto Rican independence, though, when it's people who are struggling against like a domineering power, nationalism can be a very potent political movement. And as you write about in the 20th century, within the context of Puerto Rican independence, the nationalist movement is a liberatory one.
Yes, and I think that's really important because often we live, well, always we live in the present, but I think often by living in the present, we accept our definitions of now and impose them upon the past. And I think part of what historians attempt to do is obviously we use our world of today to interpret and understand the past, but we also try to go back to understand how people in the past understood the past. So if you think of the 20th century was really marked by anti-colonial, pro-liberation, pro-national liberation struggles throughout Asia, throughout Africa, and throughout Latin America. And for most people, colonialism was this major scourge. It was the European and the US imposition of their culture, their values, their corporations, their militaries on other peoples. It was conquest, basically writ large. And so for many people, the idea was that we want to be our own nation. So concretely for Puerto Ricans thought, we're not part of this Anglo-Saxon world. We are part of the Latin American world. And what was quite startling and quite impressive was the amount of time and energy and resources the Nationalist Party put into cultivating relationships with key figures and governments and organizations throughout Latin America. And as a result of that, they got a tremendous amount of support. So if I may give one example of how that was so crucial.
Sure.
In 1950, the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party staged an uprising in Puerto Rico. And it was to oppose what I mentioned earlier, the free associated state. And as part of the process, they took over different towns in Puerto Rico. In the US media, it was reported by and large as a civil war among Puerto Ricans. In the 1950s, there was a large Puerto Rican community in New York City. And two members of the Nationalist Party, there were Nationalist Party members and organizations, chapters, I guess, in New York City, said, we've got to break this media blockade. So two of them went to Washington. The goal was to assassinate Truman, not necessarily to kill Truman. I mean, yeah, obviously to kill Truman, but the goal was to um, to sort of transform world opinion and world understanding of what was happening in Puerto Rico. They were not successful. One was killed. The other, Oscar Collazo, was given the death penalty. At that point, Puerto Ricans in New York City and in Puerto Rico galvanized and spread through the words through and called on their contacts throughout Latin America. An amazing number of people like Pablo Neruda and Gabriela Mistral, Nobel Prize winners from Chile, the president of Argentina, student organizations in Uruguay, diplomats in Costa Rica, the presidents and different political officials in Cuba all galvanized and sent telegrams, wrote petitions, did what they could say, save the life of Oscar Collazo. It got to the point that basically President Truman saved his life and said, okay, basically, he had the death penalty. He'll get life imprisonment instead. And keep in mind, this is the same time that the Rosenbergs were in prison. And despite the worldwide mobilization to save the life of the Rosenbergs, they were unable to do it. Now, of course, this is a lot more complicated. There's a lot more going on. But I think it just speaks to the power of, one, Latin American solidarity at that point, and two, the Nationalist Party, and three, how committed so many people throughout Latin America were to oppose U.S. imperialism. And one way they could do it very concretely and very directly was by protesting the approaching execution of Oscar Collazo.
In this time period, the Cuban Revolution is beginning to ramp up. Obviously, Puerto Rico and Cuba are quite close in proximity, and you mentioned how the Puerto Rican nationalist movement worked with other North American colonies, former colonies in the region, or coordinated, tried to have this solidarity with them. What was their relationship with the Cuban Revolution in the 1950s?
It was extremely close. That when Puerto Rican nationalists went into exile, many of them went to Cuba, and they worked directly, which was called the July 26 movement, which was what became the movement that ultimately overthrew Batista. And the probably foremost leaders of it are Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, which people are very familiar with.
Right.
At that point in 1950s Cuba, the Nationalist Party worked very closely with the student movement, of which Fidel Castro was the leadership. And he himself actually organized a demonstration at the U.S. Embassy.
For a quick question in the middle? Were they also leftist, communists
the Nationalist Party?
Yes.
No.
Yeah. No.
No.
Interestingly.
There were people within the party that had different political viewpoints. They were not communists. Their viewpoint, one of the main leader, Pedro Albizu Campos, said, first of all, basically, we've got to, something like, I think I'm not getting the quote exactly right, but basically build the house, meaning get independence. Then we'll decide what color to paint it. So the idea was, in order to secure independence, we have to have national unity. But they did have a program that I think possibly we would look to as sort of import substitution, how to rebuild the economy, sort of a redistribution of wealth, benefits flowing towards the workers and the peasants, but it wasn't socialist or communist. And the main reason was that the Nationalist Party, or one of the main reasons, one, many of them were very Catholic, and two, they said, we don't want to get rid of U.S. colonialism and then fall into, say, the Communist International, or sort of come under the domination of the Soviet Union. We want to be independent. Okay, so
sorry for throwing you off your axis.
That's okay. Cuba. Back to Cuba.
Back to Cuba. Apologies.
That's quite all right. So then, after the assassination attempt, the FBI, which was operating throughout Latin America at this point in time, the FBI then went into Cuba and arrested some of the nationalists in Cuba. And to me, this is one of my favorite stories that shows Latin American solidarity. This is in 1954, one of the nationalists was arrested, tortured. An FBI agent was standing right outside the door because he's Puerto Rican. He was bilingual. He could hear the English, and he could tell from the accent that the person spoke when he was talking Spanish that he was English. Because the nationalists worked with the trade union and the revolutionary student movement in Puerto Rico, they had all these contacts. He was put in jail with these people. They told, and he learned that Carlos Padilla was about to be extradited back to the United States, where he didn't want to go. He told his cellmates. His cellmates contacted the underground outside. This is pre-revolution in Cuba. This is when Batista, the dictator, was still in power. They contacted the Guatemalan embassy. At that point in Guatemala was Jacobo Arbenz, who was the very progressive president in Guatemala that the United States CIA overthrew in 1954. So there are all these interconnections.
Yes.
They then contacted him. The student underground said, "Get him out to us. Get him to such and such a place." They smuggled him on a plane, flew him to Guatemala, and then he worked in Guatemala and met up and became very, very, very close friends with Che Guevara, who was also in Guatemala prior to the overthrow of Arbenz. After Batista came to power, he then kicked the nationalists out. Two of them went to Mexico. In Mexico, they worked with the July 26th movement and were very, very, very close friends with Che Guevara and Fidel Castro. And so when they left to go to Cuba, when the July 26th movement left to go to Cuba, basically the then wife of Che Guevara was worked with the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, which is such that after the Cuban Revolution, I hope this isn't too complicated, but after the Cuban Revolution, two of the nationalists went to Cuba, became Cuban citizens, and opened up the Cuban diplomatic mission in the United Nations. So there was such a close tie, which is why the Cuban government always, especially after the Cuban Revolution, did everything it could to get the nationalist political prisoners out of jail.
And that kind of solidarity is, I think, inspiring for folks if they want to look at how globally we can coordinate against the rise of fascism, and also fight against the colonialism that still remains and the extraction in many regions of the world. But it's also just so unique in terms of Puerto Rico's proximity both to Cuba and to its colonizing power in the United States, which I think colors this. I guess I want to fast forward a little bit to the more recent history here.
Sure.
How did the nationalist movement kind of fall apart a little bit, and what is its relationship to the push for statehood now, which I know has a lot of their critics within Puerto Rico? They independence versus, all right, let's just be the 51st state for the United States.
Great question. So after the 1950 uprising, then in 1954, the nationalists led by Lolita Lebrón went into Congress and shot up Congress. They were then put in prison. Repression was so intense against Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico and against Puerto Ricans throughout the United States. So it, in a sense, led to a decline in the Nationalist Party. However, the Cuban Revolution, back to Cuba again, galvanized Puerto Ricans so that from basically the late 1950s, 1960s on, the nationalist movement, or the pro-independence, anti-colonial movement, then largely identified with Marxism, became a Marxist movement. And at this point, I think, going again to Hurricane Maria from 2017, I think it was a pretty pivotal moment for many Puerto Ricans. So many Puerto Ricans would say, if we were a U.S. state, we would be getting better assistance. Other people would say, look what it means to be a U.S. colony. It means they basically treat us terribly. I think everybody can remember the Trump throwing paper towels at people, saying,
yes.
Okay.
Like
So
he's
that's like,
shooting a 3-pointer or something. It was ridiculous.
yeah, it's like people have no electricity, water, food. You're throwing paper towels. As a result of that, actually, the support for independence has grown in Puerto Rico since Hurricane Maria. And there is also this sense of sort of, it's basically the middle party, the sort of status quo party has declined, and the pro-independence and the pro-statehood parties have both increased. It's sort of solution, something's got to happen. At the same time, you mentioned earlier, the U.S. sort of hedgerow financial people have taken over the Puerto Rican economy, which means that all these people from the United States have gone in and bought up some of the best property. They have sort of people who are doing sort of remote work are there. So that what it's meant is that a lot of Puerto Ricans can't afford to live in Puerto Rico, and there's been this tremendous brain drain. So all those sort of part of the some of the more educated intelligentsia professionals are leaving Puerto Rico because they can't afford to live there. And so you're having this demographic change take place, but at the same time, you're having ongoing resistance and opposition and unity among Puerto Ricans. So there's not an easy, like, things are just a clear road ahead for the independence movement, and there's not unity among the independence movement. That is also a factor that debilitates the movement. But there have been new parties, new organizations have formed, and new unity has been built around these candidates, which I think is very promising.
And lastly, how did austerity post 2008 play into this? The United States imposing pretty austere policies onto Puerto Rico.
Totally, that's exactly what has led to all this. So that they slash. So cut money for education, cut money for healthcare. Basically, you name it, money was cut from Puerto Ricans, which is why, for example, especially doctors, the medical professionals have not been able to sustain themselves in Puerto Rico. It's not that Puerto Ricans want to leave Puerto Rico, it's that they can't afford to stay there. Same thing for education. They have imposed people on Puerto Rico to lead the education system who don't care about the schools, don't care about the education of Puerto Rican children. So there was, for example, 2017, there was this opportunity to rebuild the electrical grid, which was destroyed by the hurricane, and to build it better, meaning to build it in an ecologically more sound way. Puerto Rico is one of the places you would use solar power. It's solar power all the time, but instead they gave money to a U.S. corporation that knew nothing. Now it's a Canadian, I believe, corporation. There are constant blackouts. The electric system is running down. Sort of the classic. Who's the highest bidder? Who can we get the most money from in order to give you the rights to run the electrical system, for example? And it's just sort of a repetition. It's a repetition, maybe on steroids, of what's been going on since 1898, of sort of how can we get as much possible out of Puerto Rico?
Yeah, I mean, why are we privatizing our electric system? We're seeing what's happening right now in Texas.
Exactly.
I mean, but of course, this is Naomi Klein, this disaster capitalism, right? I mean, this is exactly
totally
that dynamic. Well, this is really fascinating. I'd encourage everybody to read Margaret's book. It's called Solidarity Across the Americas, the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party and Anti-Imperialism. We will link to your book wherever people are listening to or watching this, and at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today, Margaret. I really appreciate you coming on.
It's been great.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely. Have a good day.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.